The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., but Lieutenant Jessica Kane was already awake. She had been lying in her narrow bunk for the past hour, staring at the ceiling of the naval base dormitory, thinking about what lay ahead. Today was the day she would either make history or become another name on the list of those who tried and failed. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Jessica rolled out of bed and walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection showed a woman of 28 with determined green eyes and short brown hair that barely touched her shoulders. But it was what she couldn't see in the mirror that mattered most, the tattoo that covered her entire back. The tattoo that had become the subject of whispers, jokes, and doubt throughout the entire naval base. The tattoo depicted a massive eagle soaring above stormy seas, its wings spread wide across her shoulder blades. Below the eagle, intricate waves crashed against jagged rocks, and at the bottom, in elegant script, were the words "Rise above the storm." It was beautiful, detailed, and meaningful to Jessica. But to many of her fellow sailors, especially the Navy SEALs, it was seen as nothing more than a distraction, a sign that she wasn't serious about her military career. Jessica had joined the Navy 6 years ago with one dream: to become the first woman to complete the most challenging underwater demolition course in naval history. The course, known as Operation Deep Strike, had been attempted by over 200 elite Navy SEALs in the past decade. Only 12 had succeeded. No woman had ever even been allowed to try. But times were changing, and after years of pushing for equal opportunities, Jessica had finally been granted permission to attempt the course. The news had spread through the base like wildfire, and the reactions were mixed. Some supported her, but many others, particularly among the SEAL teams, were skeptical. Lieutenant Commander Jake Mitchell was one of the loudest critics. He was a decorated SEAL with 15 years of experience and had completed Operation Deep Strike himself 3 years earlier. When he first heard about Jessica's opportunity, he didn't hide his doubts. At 5:15 a.m., Jessica made her way to the mess hall for breakfast. The large room was already buzzing with activity as early-rising personnel grabbed quick meals before their duties began. As she walked through with her tray, she could feel eyes following her. Some looks were curious, others supportive, but many were doubtful. She sat alone at a corner table, as had become her habit over the past few weeks. The isolation didn't bother her anymore. She had learned long ago that proving herself meant focusing on her own preparation rather than worrying about what others thought. Commander Mitchell walked past her table with 3 other SEALs. As they passed, one of them, Petty Officer First Class Ryan Torres, spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "They think that fancy art on her back is going to help her breathe underwater," he said with a smirk. The group chuckled as they continued walking. Jessica kept eating her breakfast, her expression unchanged. She had heard worse over the past few weeks. The comments about her tattoo had become almost daily occurrences. Some called it unprofessional, others said it showed she cared more about appearance than performance. The criticism stung, but it also fueled her determination. After breakfast, Jessica headed to the training facility. Operation Deep Strike would begin at 8 a.m. sharp, and she wanted to arrive early to mentally prepare. The course consisted of 3 phases, each designed to push participants beyond their physical and mental limits. Phase 1 involved a 2-mile underwater swim through a series of underwater obstacles while carrying 40 pounds of equipment. Participants had to navigate through narrow passages, around sharp coral formations, and past areas with strong currents, all while managing their oxygen supply with precision. Phase 2 required participants to plant explosive charges on simulated enemy targets while underwater, all while avoiding detection by sonar equipment. The slightest mistake in timing or positioning would result in immediate failure. Phase 3 was the most challenging, a deep-sea rescue simulation where participants had to locate and retrieve a wounded dummy from a depth of 120 feet, bring it to the surface, and perform emergency medical procedures, all within a strict time limit. The course had broken many experienced SEALs. Some failed due to equipment malfunction, others due to panic in the deep water, and many simply because the physical demands were too great. Jessica knew the statistics, but she also knew her own capabilities. At 7:30 a.m., Jessica arrived at the dock where the course would begin. A crowd had gathered instructors, fellow sailors, and even some base personnel who had heard about the historic attempt. Among them stood Admiral William Hayes, the base commander, a man known for his fair but demanding leadership style. Commander Mitchell was there as well, serving as one of the primary instructors for the course. His job was to evaluate Jessica's performance and determine whether she met the standards required to pass. His reputation for being tough but fair was well known throughout the base. As Jessica began suiting up in her diving gear, she overheard more comments from the gathered SEALs. Some were making bets about how long she would last. Others were questioning whether the standards would be lowered just because she was a woman. The negativity was thick in the air, but Jessica had learned to use doubt as motivation. At exactly 8 a.m., Commander Mitchell called Jessica to the starting position. The water was choppy, with 3-foot waves that would make the dive more challenging than usual. The underwater course had been set up the night before, with obstacles positioned at various depths between 20 and 60 feet. "Jessica, you understand the requirements," Commander Mitchell said in his official tone. "You have 45 minutes to complete Phase 1. Any deviation from the course, any safety violations, or failure to complete within the time limit will result in immediate disqualification. Do you understand?" "Understood, sir," Jessica replied, her voice steady and confident. She adjusted her diving mask, checked her equipment one final time, and positioned herself at the edge of the dock. The weight of the 40-pound equipment pack felt familiar on her back. She had trained with this exact weight for months, building her strength and endurance specifically for this moment. At the signal, Jessica dove into the cold Atlantic water. The shock of the temperature change was immediate, but she had expected it and controlled her breathing accordingly. She descended quickly to the first checkpoint at 20 feet, where she had to navigate through a series of metal hoops while maintaining perfect buoyancy control. Above the surface, the crowd watched the tracking monitors that showed Jessica's location and depth. Commander Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, watching the data with professional interest. Despite his public skepticism, he had reviewed Jessica's training records and knew she was exceptionally prepared. The first obstacle required Jessica to swim through 5 metal rings, each positioned at different angles and depths. The challenge was to move through them without touching the sides while carrying the heavy equipment pack. One wrong move could cause her to lose buoyancy control or damage her gear. Jessica approached the first ring with calculated precision. Her movements were smooth and controlled as she glided through each obstacle. Her training had taught her to conserve energy while maintaining speed, and it showed in her technique. 20 minutes into Phase 1, Jessica reached the most difficult section of the course, a narrow underwater canyon with strong cross-currents. Many previous candidates had failed here, either by being pushed off course by the current or by panicking in the confined space. Jessica had studied this section extensively. She knew that the key was to use the current rather than fight it, timing her movements to work with the water's natural flow. As she entered the canyon, she felt the powerful current trying to push her sideways, but she adjusted her position and used the force to help propel her forward. The crowd above watched in tense silence as Jessica's tracking dot moved through the canyon section. Even Commander Mitchell found himself impressed by her technique. Her movements showed the kind of underwater skill that usually took years to develop. With 10 minutes remaining, Jessica emerged from the canyon and faced the final challenge of Phase 1, a simulated shipwreck that she had to navigate through to reach the exit point. The artificial wreck was designed to be confusing and disorienting, with multiple dead-end passages and obstacles that could trap an unprepared diver. Jessica had memorized the layout of this section during her preparation. She moved through the wreck with confidence, avoiding the trap passages and finding the correct route to the exit. As she emerged from the final obstacle, she could see the surface marker that indicated the end of Phase 1. She surfaced with 3 minutes to spare, her breathing controlled despite the intense physical exertion. The crowd on the dock had grown larger, with word spreading throughout the base that Jessica was not only completing the course, but doing so with impressive skill. Commander Mitchell checked his stopwatch and made notes on his evaluation sheet. Despite his initial doubts, he had to admit that Jessica's performance in Phase 1 was among the best he had ever seen. Her technique was flawless, her timing was perfect, and her physical conditioning was exceptional. After a 20-minute rest period, Phase 2 began. This phase required Jessica to plant simulated explosive charges on 3 different underwater targets while avoiding detection by sonar equipment. The targets were positioned at depths between 40 and 80 feet, and each charge had to be placed with perfect precision to be considered successful. The sonar equipment used in the exercise was operated by experienced technicians who were trained to detect even the slightest disturbance in the water. Jessica would have to move like a ghost, using advanced underwater stealth techniques that few people had mastered. She descended to the first target, a simulated enemy submarine positioned at 40 feet. The sonar equipment immediately began scanning for her location, sending out pulses that could detect movement, air bubbles, or changes in water pressure. Jessica had trained extensively for this type of challenge, learning to control not only her movements, but also her breathing and heart rate to minimize detection. Moving with incredible precision, Jessica approached the first target. She had to place the explosive charge in a specific location that would theoretically cause maximum damage while avoiding the areas that were monitored by motion sensors. One wrong move would trigger an alarm and result in immediate failure. Jessica attached the first charge successfully and moved toward the second target. This one was positioned at 60 feet and required her to approach from a specific angle to avoid the sonar coverage. The challenge was complicated by the fact that she had to maintain perfect buoyancy while maneuvering in 3 dimensions. The second charge was placed successfully, and Jessica moved toward the final target at 80 feet. This was the deepest part of Phase 2, and the pressure at this depth made every movement more difficult. Her equipment felt heavier, her air consumption increased, and the nitrogen narcosis that affects deep divers began to cloud her thinking slightly. But Jessica had trained for these exact conditions. She had logged hundreds of hours at similar depths, building her body's adaptation to the pressure and learning to think clearly even when affected by nitrogen narcosis. She approached the final target with the same precision she had shown throughout the exercise. The final charge was placed perfectly, and Jessica began her controlled ascent to the surface. Phase 2 had taken 38 minutes of the 45-minute time limit, and she had completed it without triggering a single alarm or detection. Commander Mitchell was openly impressed now. Phase 2 had a failure rate of over 60%, even among experienced SEALs. Jessica's performance had been not just successful, but exceptional. Her stealth techniques were as good as anything he had seen from his most elite team members. The crowd on the dock had grown even larger as word of Jessica's success spread throughout the base. Sailors from different departments had come to witness what was becoming a historic day. Even some of the SEALs who had been skeptical were now watching with genuine interest and respect. After another rest period, Phase 3 began at 2:17 p.m. This was the phase that had broken more candidates than any other. The deep-sea rescue simulation required Jessica to descend to 120 feet, locate a weighted dummy representing a wounded diver, bring it to the surface, and perform emergency medical procedures, all within 30 minutes. The depth alone was challenging enough. At 120 feet, the water pressure was nearly 4 times greater than at the surface. Every movement required more effort, air consumption increased dramatically, and the risk of decompression sickness became a real concern if proper ascent procedures weren't followed. Jessica began her descent, following a guide rope that led to the area where the dummy was hidden. The instructors had placed it in a location that would be difficult to find and even more difficult to retrieve. The dummy weighed 70 pounds and was designed to be awkward to handle, simulating the challenge of rescuing an unconscious person underwater. As she descended past the 100-foot mark, Jessica felt the familiar effects of extreme depth. Her movements became more deliberate, her thinking slightly slower. But her training kicked in, and she followed the procedures she had practiced hundreds of times. At 120 feet, Jessica began searching for the dummy. The underwater visibility was limited, and the instructors had placed several false targets to confuse candidates. She had to methodically search the area while carefully monitoring her air supply and bottom time. After 8 minutes of searching, Jessica located the dummy. It was wedged between two large rocks in a position that would make extraction extremely difficult. This was the moment where many candidates failed. The combination of physical exhaustion, mental stress, and time pressure often led to panic or poor decision-making. Jessica assessed the situation calmly. She had trained for scenarios just like this, where the obvious solution wasn't necessarily the best one. Instead of trying to pull the dummy free directly, she repositioned herself and used a technique called the pivot lift to leverage the dummy out of its trapped position. With the dummy secured, Jessica began the most critical part of Phase 3, the control descent. Bringing an unconscious victim to the surface from 120 feet required precise buoyancy control and careful attention to ascent rate. Too fast, and both she and the dummy could suffer from decompression sickness. Too slow, and she would run out of air before reaching the surface. Jessica had practiced this exact scenario countless times in training. She maintained a steady ascent rate of 30 feet per minute, stopping at 60 feet for a 2-minute safety stop as required by diving protocols. Throughout the ascent, she had to maintain control of the heavy, awkward dummy while monitoring her own air supply and depth. At 3:03 p.m., Jessica broke the surface with the dummy in tow. But Phase 3 wasn't over yet. She still had to perform emergency medical procedures on the dummy while treading water in the choppy seas. This part of the exercise tested not only her medical knowledge, but also her ability to perform complex tasks while exhausted and under pressure. Jessica positioned herself and the dummy according to water rescue protocols and began the simulated emergency treatment. She had to demonstrate proper airway management, chest compressions, and rescue breathing techniques while maintaining both herself and the victim in a stable position in the water. The medical simulation continued for 8 minutes, with Jessica performing all procedures correctly despite her physical exhaustion. When Commander Mitchell finally called an end to the exercise, Jessica had completed all 3 phases of Operation Deep Strike with a total time of 2 hours and 51 minutes, well within the 4-hour maximum time limit. As Jessica was helped onto the dock, the crowd that had gathered began to applaud. What had started as skeptical curiosity had transformed into genuine admiration and respect. She had not only completed the course, but had done so with a performance that ranked among the best in the program's history. Commander Mitchell approached Jessica as she removed her diving gear. His expression had changed completely from the skepticism he had shown that morning. "Lieutenant Kane," he said, "I owe you an apology. Your performance today was exceptional by any standard. You have not only completed Operation Deep Strike, but have done so with distinction." The celebration was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Hayes, who had been monitoring the exercise from the command center. The crowd parted as he walked directly to where Jessica stood, still dripping from her dive. Admiral Hayes was known throughout the Navy as a man who rarely showed emotion and never gave praise lightly. He had commanded naval operations around the world and had served with some of the most elite military units in existence. When he spoke, people listened. "Lieutenant Kane," Admiral Hayes said in a voice that carried across the dock, "your performance today has been truly remarkable. You have demonstrated the highest levels of skill, courage, and professionalism that define the best of our naval service." Then, to everyone's surprise, Admiral Hayes did something that no one expected. He looked directly at Jessica and said, "I understand that some people have questioned your commitment to military service based on personal choices about your appearance. I want to address that directly." The crowd fell completely silent. Even Commander Mitchell looked surprised by the Admiral's words. "Lieutenant Kane, would you please turn around?" Admiral Hayes requested. Jessica, unsure of what was happening, turned so that her back was facing the Admiral. Her diving suit was partially unzipped, and the top portion of her tattoo was visible above the neckline. Admiral Hayes stepped closer and spoke in a voice that everyone could hear. This tattoo, which some have mocked or questioned, represents something that every person in military service should understand. The eagle rising above the storm is not just art. It is a symbol of what we all strive to be. It represents the courage to rise above challenges, to soar above adversity, and to maintain our strength even in the darkest storms. He paused, looking around at the crowd that had gathered. Today, Lieutenant Kane has proven that she embodies the very spirit depicted in this tattoo. She has risen above doubt, soared above the challenges that have broken many before her, and maintained her strength through one of the most demanding tests our Navy has to offer. Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone present, Admiral Hayes came to attention and rendered a sharp military salute directly toward Jessica's back and the tattoo that had been the subject of so much criticism. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Here was one of the most respected leaders in the Navy, publicly honoring not just Jessica's achievement, but also the personal expression that had made her a target of doubt and criticism. One by one, the other personnel present came to attention and joined the Admiral's salute. Commander Mitchell was among the first, followed by the other instructors, and then the SEALs who had been present. Even Petty Officer Torres, who had made mocking comments just that morning, rendered a respectful salute. Jessica turned back around, tears in her eyes not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of what had just occurred. She had not only achieved her goal of completing Operation Deep Strike, but had done so in a way that changed minds and challenged assumptions. Admiral Hayes spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and experience. Lieutenant Kane, your achievement today goes beyond personal success. You have opened a door that had been closed and proved that excellence comes in many forms. Your tattoo, far from being a distraction or sign of lack of seriousness, has become a symbol of determination and strength that others will remember and be inspired by. The ceremony concluded with Admiral Hayes announcing that Jessica's performance would be officially recognized, and that she would be recommended for advanced underwater operations training. But more importantly, her success had changed the conversation about women in elite military roles and about the judgments that people make based on personal appearance. In the weeks that followed, Jessica's story spread throughout the naval community and beyond. She became a symbol not just for women in military service, but for anyone who had ever been judged or doubted based on how they looked rather than what they could accomplish. The tattoo that had once been a source of mockery became a symbol of inspiration. Other service members began sharing their own stories about overcoming prejudice and proving their worth through performance rather than appearance. Jessica's achievement had started a larger conversation about judging people by their abilities rather than their personal choices. Commander Mitchell, who had been one of Jessica's harshest critics, became one of her strongest advocates. He later said in an interview that Jessica's performance had taught him an important lesson about the danger of making assumptions based on personal bias rather than objective evaluation. 6 months later, Jessica was selected for an elite underwater demolition unit, becoming the first woman to serve in that capacity. She continued to excel in her military career, eventually being promoted to lieutenant commander and taking on training responsibilities for new candidates attempting Operation Deep Strike. The tattoo on her back remained unchanged, but its meaning had evolved. What had started as a personal expression of her own determination had become a symbol recognized throughout the Navy as representing the ability to rise above challenges and exceed expectations. Years later, when new candidates asked about the story behind her tattoo and her historic achievement, Jessica would tell them that the most important lesson wasn't about proving others wrong, but about staying true to yourself while working to achieve your goals. She would explain that the eagle soaring above the storm represented not just personal strength, but the strength that comes from persevering despite doubt and criticism. The story of Jessica Kane and her tattoo became legendary within naval circles, passed down from one generation of service members to the next. It served as a reminder that true strength comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from having the courage to be yourself while striving for excellence in everything you do. Admiral Hayes' salute that day became symbolic of something larger, the recognition that in military service, as in life, what matters most is not how someone looks or what personal choices they make about their appearance, but how they perform when it matters most. Jessica had proven that excellence transcends superficial judgments, and her achievement opened doors for countless others who would follow in her path. The SEALs who had once mocked her tattoo became some of her strongest supporters, and the story of that day served as a powerful reminder throughout the naval community that true leadership means recognizing and honoring excellence wherever it is found, regardless of the package it comes in.